my friends who was a missionary here in Africa told me a very fascinating story. Her husband passed on suddenly through a heart attack, and they had to obviously take his remains back home. They realized the cheapest way of doing it was cremation, which in their culture and context is quite acceptable and normal. And so she had his ashes in an urn and was now going through the normal security check at the airport. And she had this urn on her carry-on, you can understand, for something so personal that she kind of didn't want it anywhere but as close to her as possible. And these ashes were her husband's anyways. So the guys at by the x-ray at the security check asked her, what's in there, or what is this? Because they didn't quite know what it was. And then she answered rather unexpectedly, and she says, well, that's my husband. The guys took off from this place knowing that the remains of a person were now in this urn. They just left as fast as they could. My laughing about this moment was just these are security people who are presented with the ashes of a person who is deceased. And we're talking ashes here, but it was enough to scare them to run for their dear lives and had to be called back to say, no, this is simply ashes. But I want to talk about death today. Because really, if you ask me, death is perhaps Africa's deepest obsession. And I'm using the word obsession because when someone dies in Africa, the whole world comes to a standstill. You will notice that in normal lives, people are busy and they may not even have the opportunity to visit their loved ones. Even when they look like they're going to pass on and things are serious, they will still carry on about their daily business. But when a person dies, the whole world comes to a standstill. And people will cancel important appointments. People will stop whatever they are doing. And if anything, they show up at the funeral because this is an important occasion. I've also observed here in Johannesburg, where I'm based, that at the end of every month, around the different parks, close to where I live and even beyond, are these groupings of people that come together, and they are members of various burial societies. I have not really been brought up under a culture where I was exposed to burial societies. When I started asking some of my friends, so what's a burial society really all about? You know, give it to me in a few lines. They say it's a society that collects money as part of the membership every month, a stipulated amount that you pay to the burial society, so that when you die, you'll be given a dignified funeral. As you can imagine, because I guess of my belief system based on the Word of God, I am stunned that people would loyally and honestly give themselves religiously to an organization that will simply promise to bury you or give you a decent burial when that time comes. Well, part of my being facetious about this is, how do you know that they will even give you a decent burial? Because the truth is, you won't even be there. But be that as it may, people really, really value these burial societies, which you can see by the attendance. I mean, some of the parks are so so taken over by these various groups. And it's not just one burial society, there's a whole range of them all over the place that you will actually come to find in place. But not just that, I've also noticed an escalation of funeral policies in this nation. Even banks are now offering funeral policies. Besides your typical life insurance, which I thought people would go for, you actually now have a funeral policy. There are even other insurance companies that have a particular product for foreigners in a given nation, so that when you die, they can repatriate your remains to your country of origin. And I'm told that's quite big business. I'm not giving anybody some ideas here. I'm just mentioning a fact to show how obsessed we are with death. And not just insurance companies and banks. Now, I was surprised, or pleasantly surprised, that one of our soccer clubs here in South Africa offers a funeral plan. So they already have a following, obviously, because they're one of the biggest soccer clubs in the nation. But beyond just having this big following, they are taking advantage of this captive audience by offering what is seemingly a small amount of money that members pay towards their funeral policy, so that when that day comes, the person will get a decent burial. But perhaps our starting point for our discussion should be this: elaborate funerals and burial rites are indicative of deep-seated traditional beliefs about death. Deep-seated traditional beliefs about death. Now, I have observed, when I think about this statement, you can even have a family in a given context who, by our definition, are not even well off. But come the death of a loved one, and suddenly you see the escalation of their standards. The funeral is well catered for, and the deceased is buried in a casket, a very fancy casket for that matter. And hearses appear, and these are very Lani vehicles, if you like, that almost look sometimes out of place in the context, because you may not have even seen such vehicles by that residence, but someone dies, you will see this very, very elaborate and very expensive funeral taking place, as probably telling us there is something behind that motivates people to take their time and flash so much money, if you like, when someone dies. And sometimes you will notice not just the funeral itself, but the tombstone. Oh my goodness. I have seen tombstones that are like, my goodness, do they intend this person to enjoy what exactly is going on? I've seen tombstones where it's like there's a television set, maybe it's a story about this person who used to be in the entertainment industry, and they're now trying to showcase that this person was really in the media, and this person used to be quite a personality. But the expense that people go into in making such statement is obviously concerning for me. What are the beliefs that drive people to go to such extents? Please hear me. If you can afford it and that's the way you want to express yourselves, yeah, it's fine, perhaps. But for the average person, this extravagance, this showbiz around funerals is really, really concerning. So what you see happens is the funeral is very elaborate, but the lives of those who are left behind don't take off from that moment and maintain those standards that you saw during the funeral. No, as just during the funeral, that's where these things happen. And after the funeral, some people really struggle. And so you're asking, just from a logical human perspective, shouldn't we have taken these resources and invested them in the lives of those that remain, so at least their livelihood is a little bit better, and so forth. So, well, be that as it may, people are not perturbed. They are not even considering those that remain. The focus is on the person that has passed on. And you see very, very, very elaborate funerals, very elaborate tombstones. One of the recent ones I saw was the replica of the person who had passed on, erected at his tombstone, and obviously for quite a large amount of money. And I also overheard that the family was not happy with the image, so they took it down and are now erecting a new one to replace the one that they had put in the first place, because it's not quite, doesn't quite capture the person concerned. Well, be that as it may, it's not just here in South Africa or in Southern Africa where I've experienced this extravagance. Recently, in one of my visits in Ghana, I asked to attend a funeral because I was doing research for these presentations, and they have a particular part of the funeral where they dance with the deceased. A group of young men had been hired to come and do a few routine dances with the casket. I watched breathlessly as these men were negotiating their dances and maintaining this casket with the body in it, by the way, as they did their dances. It was quite something to watch. And I was asking myself, who is this for? Is it for us who are attending the service or this funeral? Is it for the deceased? Because, I mean, you understand the deceased is gone. He's not there anymore. It's just the remains of this person who are there. So who is really being danced with and for at this point? These were questions just going through my mind because I'm not part of this culture, and I was trying to understand what was really going on. The answer I got is they're honoring the deceased with the final dance, if you like. Wow, what a moment. What a moment, if I may say. Now, I thought, well, that really has to take the show for me, until I came across a story again of a man who buried his mother in a Hummer. I mean, an SUV. A whole 4x4. Like a functional vehicle. And he buries his mother in a Hummer. My goodness, what is going on? What is motivating all this elaboration of funerals where people will stop at nothing to express what they want to express? Or another story of a man, this is in America, happens to be African, who wanted to be buried in his vehicle, a 1973 limited edition. He wanted to take it all with him. What is going on, really, is the question I have at the back of my mind. So let me make a couple of observations, perhaps, that will help us qualify what really happens in these profound moments. So the first thing we need to say up front as an observation is death and burial rites are dictated by culture to such an extent that Christianity is almost silent, if not silenced. At the back of my mind, when I've attended several funerals and I see this escalation of levels, knowing the people concerned sometimes, I've often asked, why does not the pastor say something or intervene in the situation where he says to the people, no, we have to be concerned about your life after this funeral, where we put resources together, for example, so that your livelihood is catered for? No, Christianity almost has no say, because this is happening right amongst us who believe. We are the ones who will go out of our way and pay these exorbitant amounts. A friend of mine was telling me a short while ago about a funeral of a friend that they are going to have. And in some contexts, it takes a month or two just preparing, please hear me, preparing for a funeral. I'm wondering at the back of my mind, what are we really preparing for? Because all that's going to happen ultimately is a person is going to be lowered in a 6x2x6 little hole, and that's all they need. That's all that ultimately happens. Maybe I'm speaking in very undignified terms here. I am trying to explain the ultimate, what actually happens at the end of the day. Why does it take so long for us? 3 months sometimes. And I've even heard of a situation somewhere in Nigeria where it took 9 months of preparation because this person was perceived to be so great. So they are, by the way, paying for storage of this body in this interim period while they're doing all these preparations. And some people even brag and tell you how much they're going to spend, as if that's something really worth celebrating. So, death and burial rites are being dictated by culture to such an extent that Christianity has been silenced. It has no say whatsoever. The second observation that I can make in this whole context is death in Africa is perceived as the transition of a person from the present state into the next, where they attain supernatural status for continued participation in the lives of the living. Now, I found this to be true right across the continent, where when a person dies, it is not the end. In fact, it's simply a transition from this life to the next. But the next life is they attain this supernatural status, and this supernatural status may even give them the label the living dead, because they are not regarded as having gone and it's over, but they continue to participate in the lives of the living. Well, that's very fascinating. It is perhaps one of the reasons why we are so captured by death. Because death, if this conception is the modus operandi, you can appreciate why people go out of the way. Because this person has transitioned into a new status, into a new place where they now have more powers than they used to in their previous life on earth. And by the way, this applies to almost anybody. So as soon as you die, you attain this status and you become this living dead who continues to have a say in the lives of those that remain. Wow. That is what is informing a lot of the decisions we make around funerals. That's what is going down. Now, we're going to obviously interrogate all of this a little later. I just want us to understand the worldview motivating why we behave the way we do. But the third observation that I can add to this, which is equally as important, is out of this translation emerges the notable concepts then of elaborate funerals and veneration of the dead, or more appropriately, the ancestors. Now, that's a word that evokes a whole bunch of reflections in our context here in Africa. Ancestors. Now, I am deliberately using this concept of veneration of the ancestors because you will discover that in this context, people have a fair understanding of there being a supreme being who is God. So there's one God. So it's a very monotheistic culture. But the ancestors then are the mediators because God is this unapproachable, distant figure, person, deity. We can't approach him directly. So the ancestors are venerated with the view that they then are our representatives before God. That's the understanding. So veneration is not quite worship, and I wouldn't use the word worship, ancestral worship. I prefer the word veneration. It's almost an understanding that, okay, there is this God who needs to be worshipped and be paid homage to, and the way to him is through the ancestors. That is the understanding I gather right across the African context. So, knowing that a person, when they die, they're going to be translated into this status. That basically means when we now lay their remains to rest, that is why we have to now, as a last parting statement, go out of our way to make sure their funeral is the way it is. That is what has captured us right across this continent. The understanding that when a person dies, it's not over. In fact, it's a better place. And people make that statement not always in a Christian sense of it, or he is resting, or he is in a much better place. Because their understanding is, well, he has gone to be with the departed. And the departed have an ongoing statement, an ongoing say, an ongoing involvement in the lives of those that are living. It's perhaps a good point for some of us to stop and reflect on, is this really the worldview that has motivated why we do what we do? Because every single funeral that I have attended on this continent, and it doesn't matter where I've gone, I see the same elaborate expressions of wealth, of very expensive things being used, and in some instances, like the catering is of the top notch. You see that over and over and over again. And I appreciate that in our communities, again, I've seen this right across the continent, the community comes to assist with families and so forth. But why do we only wait until someone has passed on for us to assist a family? Is it just this concept of death that motivates us to be of more assistance, to really come together as a community to help? Is there more that we could do? So these are questions at the back of my mind, and I hope yours too, as you process this aspect of death. Recently, I don't know how it happened, but I received in my email inbox, an invitation, an advert to consider joining a funeral policy by a certain company. And they were asking a very nominal amount for them to give me a decent burial. I wrote them back and I asked, do you have a policy that can help me and my family now? For a few weeks, they did not respond. Because why? I think death has captured us, and we need to rethink how we process all of this. So one of the descriptions then that we need to come to a fuller understanding and appreciation of is this idea of veneration of the dead, which is a practice really based on the belief that the deceased and often family members have a continued existence and or possess the ability to influence and notice fortunes or misfortunes of the living when they are transitioned into the afterlife, where they attain this minor supernatural power. That is something that has captured us. So you find, by and large, ancestral veneration is augmented by a belief in the supreme being, where prayers and or sacrifices are usually offered to the ancestors as intermediaries between God and the living. And I think I underscored that point already. I'm just trying to rehearse what we are dealing with so we come to a much fuller understanding right across the board as to why death captures us the way it actually does. One of the studies I came across looks at this whole aspect of ancestral worship. How do we get Christians to process all of this? And the authors of this article say that although Africans have welcomed the gospel, some African Christians have not yet abandoned the beliefs and practices of traditional religions. A lot of us have not yet found a way to go past our traditional beliefs. We made the point already that when it comes to existential challenges, and death being one of those, regardless of what we may believe and what we may even hold on based on our understanding of God's word, when we have a serious challenge like death, especially something that we can't quite explain, the tendency is to just revert to our traditional beliefs. So there are even attempts by some Christian groupings to incorporate some of these traditional beliefs in their understanding. And what you notice with groupings like that is they're very popular. They form some of our biggest denominations across the continent as because they have embraced some of these cultural aspects and they've just become part and parcel of the newfound faith. So where do we go from here? How do we process all of this, with us trying to really come to a biblical understanding of what death is all about? Because when one closely analyzes the nature of Christianity in Africa, it becomes readily apparent that African Christians have somewhat achieved a synthesis of traditional religious beliefs and Christianity. In some respects, where there's a coincidence of traditional beliefs and biblical culture, I don't think we need to be worried or concerned about that. It's at points where there is variance, where there is direct conflict between what the Word of God teaches and perhaps the practices we carry on perennially holding on to. That is really where our discussion needs to take place. By the way, being trapped in this ancestral veneration, you may discover, is not really peculiar to Africa. There are other cultures as well in Asia, in my research, that I've come across, and some cultures in South America and other parts of the world where you find there are similar entrapments to this ancestral veneration, if you like. There are some other religions, some of them even Christians, that, as I've mentioned already, have incorporated this in their outlook. So I wanna just make a few quick points in terms of really why this entrapment is so real for us. Now, I've already intimated by this word syncretism, which is not a word we use every day, but syncretism is the amalgamation of African or any other culture for that matter, African culture with Christianity, which indicates the inability to completely let go of certain obligations. So syncretism is when we discover that there are some of our cultural aspects that we have been practicing for time immemorial, and we carry on practicing these cultural traits, these cultural practices, and we then, in view of that, become Christians, and we somehow feel that we can't let go of what the cultural practices and injunctions are. We simply incorporate them into our new found faith. That is what syncretism really is. It seems the most convenient thing to do, isn't it? Because it's almost like you are satisfying both sides of the world, you know, your traditional cultural and then your Christian faith, and you kind of find a way of merging the two, and life carries on. But that's one of the reasons why we have this entrapment. What it really translates to is we are Christianizing a practice without interrogating it first according to a biblical standard. We simply find a way of making it acceptable, and then we carry on practicing it. And sometimes we even find a convenient way of incorporating that very practice in words or language that makes it acceptable, and then we Christianize it. We carry on practicing it. And then syncretism, this amalgamation of culture and faith, actually takes place. Now, as I've already intimated, there are some aspects where that is possible because there is coincidence, similarities. Remember, God is the author of all cultures. Cultures are supposed to be seeking after God, but in the process, we may have lost the ability to seek God in truth in the way that He should be sought after. And so we've introduced in our cultures things that can go against God Himself. Now we need to retrieve those aspects and find what God teaches. But in many instances, we are not making that call. We are simply adopting alongside our faith the things that our culture has imposed on us, and life goes on. That is what syncretism is all about. Now, in my own language, they have an expression that they use when they come to this profound moment. They will say, ndezwe chivanu. In other words, these are traditional things. Bottom line, well, Christianity can't quite deal with this because this is really about us. It's almost suggesting that Christianity is this specialist kind of approach to life, that our traditions are really so staunch and this is really who we are. Christianity is a part of our lives. So the first thing I need to recognize is who I am is defined by my culture, because my culture determines everything I do. To the extent that sometimes I have to bring alongside my culture with my faith, and then I exist as such, even if the things I'm bringing from my culture are actually not biblical. That is what syncretism really is. A big word, but really trying to describe and help us decipher what really is going on. And I'm taking my time about this because I want us to understand why we are trapped. Why we are trapped by these realities. Number two, then, in terms of the entrapment, is the blending is necessitated by the belief that Christianity does not always address the deepest needs and notice and fears of the African people. The word that should really stand out there for us is the word fear. Fear is this reservation. Maybe that's not even a strong word, but it's this perspective that says, if I offend my culture and everything that this culture represents, there will be serious retributions. Or when I notice that things are not quite going the way they are, the African mindset says, well, I have done something, that's why things are going the way they are. Remember the word misfortunes? So, in the African worldview, things don't just happen. Things happen for a reason. And remember, there's this interconnectedness, interrelatedness of entities and spirits and all sorts. So this is a world where one thing has implications on another. Now, it means if something is not going on well here, there is something perhaps that has gone wrong that I need to now go and fix. That's how intricate the culture is, and perhaps inescapable. So we are then trapped by this fear that says, I may have done something that is now offended the different entities and spirits and forces at play. Therefore, I need to live and tread a very careful line in terms of honoring my cultural obligations, if you like. So those fears really motivate people. I remember I lost my dad. Well, I didn't really lose him. He passed on and went to be with the Lord a year ago. Now, the interesting thing about his passing on, he had been unwell for quite a while. And I travel and do leadership trainings all over the world. And so when his health was deteriorating and I was wondering what was happening, every trip became very, very sensitive for me. Because part of the sensitivity of every travel was it could happen when I'm just about to board a flight and go to a training or something like that. So I wanted to find a way of saying, if this happened while I'm about to board a flight and I get that dreaded phone call, your dad has passed on, what would I do? Do I turn around? Do I go carry on with my obligations? And I speak sometimes at international conferences, huge conferences for that matter. So what informs my decision at that precise point? Now, I'll tell you, for many people, I had conversations with, so you must honor your father. He will be sad if you don't. It's interesting that even the most profound of Christians, what was motivating their advice to me was the fear of offending my father, who, by the way, would be gone. But it was interesting to notice that people really were motivated by this fear of retribution. That is the reason we get trapped as well. The fear of the unknown. The fear that something is just going to go wrong. The fear that this collapse, these misfortunes, this series of events that may be disastrous. Now, if there's a series of events that look like they've been in this continuous pattern of negative experiences, people, they say, oh, stop. Something is wrong here. This is not normal. Life does just not happen this way. There's something that needs to be done. Now, they don't always turn to their faith to speak into this moment. No, there's something in the culture. There's something in our upbringing. There's something in who we are that needs to be redressed. So that fear cult entraps us much deeper into this. Now, thirdly, I need to say that then reverting to traditional religious practices is mostly associated with ancestors who are considered to be the force behind everything and the fear of retribution for displeasing them. Oh, we come back to that word again, ancestors. Ancestors. The living dead. Those who are departed. Who, in Africa's conception, have a say in what goes on around here. We need to be paying homage to them according to the cultural prescriptions if things are to go on well for us. Needless to say, there again, we are trapped by this belief because our culture simply says you need to pay homage to those who are departed. We have to now do what is necessary to ensure that life is the way it needs to be. Now, I've already underscored this point. I'm not going to dwell on it as much, but simply to point that the ancestors, that's a huge point, huge discussion point on this continent. If we can overcome this idea of venerating the dead, associating the dead with having a say amongst the living, part of our entrapment will be resolved. But somehow this is where the stronghold lies. Hence, we go out of our way to do what we do. But fourthly, because of the belief that the universe is essentially a system of interrelated entities or spirits or divination, then divination becomes plausible for an explanation, especially when things go wrong. So, in this point, what we need to realize is that we have this concept of how the universe works, how things work. So, by our observation, when things go wrong, things just didn't go wrong. That's our worldview. Our worldview says, no, there is something else here. Now, the truth of the matter, that something else is not obvious to us because it's not revealed to us. Now, for us to understand what happened or what is happening, I have to go to those with the authority to now engage with those in the afterlife, and those in the afterlife can then relay the message of what needs to be sorted, and then life can move on and go as much as possible. That's where the cruciality of so-called witch doctors becomes evident across this continent. I've yet to come across a culture on the continent of Africa that does not honor the prominent role of so-called witch doctors. Witch doctors are these men and women endowed with authority to now consult those that are departed so they can relay a message on what needs to be done, especially when things go wrong. Once in a while, when I have a moment, and I don't always have it, but when I do watch African movies, because I like watching a few of them, because I get ideas behind some of the cultural beliefs and practices, because they're always portrayed. Now, in my estimation, and I haven't really done this religiously, but in a rough estimate, almost 80% of African movies have a scene where someone consults a witch doctor. Without fail. Without fail. Now, that fascinates me. Now, the same statistical estimation that I have, that I just shared with you, is endorsed by a study done recently that says across this continent, 80% of Africans consult a witch doctor. Wait a minute. If 80% of Africans consult a witch doctor, and the majority of people in Africa are Christian, I don't have to finish the rest, right? It means we are simply trapped by this ourselves. And perhaps we've been in a delegation that says, let's go consult what's happening. You don't have to be a part of it, but in a sense, there are some permissible elements where you are participating from a distance, but you're really endorsing the idea, okay, let's go find out what's going on. Although you may not be the person that goes in there to engage with the witch doctor, but you could be part of a delegation. Maybe you could even drive a delegation. You also are curious to see what goes on. My point is simply this. We're trapped. We are trapped by this. When things go wrong, now the Bible describes myriads of occasions, of experiences by godly men and women when things went wrong for them, where they've asked and pleaded with God to help them, and sometimes God said no, because, you need to go through this and so forth. But somehow for us, when things go wrong, we simply have this aversity to suffering. We don't want to go through experiences of that nature. And I remember having a conversation with a lady, and it was a very sad conversation. She had 5 daughters, and all of them had children out of wedlock. And she says to me, there's a curse on my family, and I need to find out where this curse is coming from. And she's a Christian lady, committed to the Lord, part of the leadership. She wanted to find out, why is it that all her daughters got married or had children out of wedlock? Very sad story. And then I asked them, so where is your husband? Where is your husband? She says to me, well, I had different men throughout my life that I thought I would get married to, but things never really worked out. I didn't say this to her, but I actually wanted to say, well, after 5 men, something should have emerged. There's a pattern here that for you, you also had children out of wedlock. Why do you think your daughters will do any different? Because they may have observed you taking in men because they were growing with the presence of different men in their lives. So in their minds, they normalized the idea of entertaining men like you did. But somehow, because things have gone wrong, she now wants to consult. That's the entrapment I'm talking about. You know what? Sometimes things go wrong, not because things really must go wrong. That's because we made stupid decisions. And we are simply reaping the fruit of the decisions that we made. But for some strange reason, we want a deeper reason. What is going on? Because our worldview says, I need to consult higher powers that need to tell me what's going on in my life. I used to have friends who tell me, you know, you need to study very, very hard and then, go and consult in terms of your exams and so forth. You could see this African worldview coming through again, even in those profound moments. When a guy who was not studying failed his exam, the parents say, I don't know what happened. He's a smart kid. Well, we need help. We need help. Maybe the fifth thing I can add to all these ideas behind the entrapments, then the point I've already made, then witch doctors are very instrumental in broking the spiritual power between the living and their ancestors. And it's a very important point to make. The reason I want it to be a standalone point is to then make this transition to say, because of this worldview, that's why you find even when people become Christians, they idolize the pastor, especially if the pastor is seen as prophetic, is seen as apostolic, is seen as possessing these supernatural abilities, because in the worldview, the pastor is simply replacing the role that the witch doctor used to play. And I want to make that point quite clearly, because you will find then, that's why when certain men of God come around, people almost worship them, because they are consulting them for answers beyond the norm. So you will find, and I'm not pulling down in any man of God, please, I'm just saying, understand the worldview that motivates people to look at a pastor, to look at a prophet, to look at an apostle a certain way, because effectively what they are doing is seeing him as somebody who is going to play that role that a witch doctor does, especially when things go wrong. When you ask people about their church experiences, how was the teaching last Sunday? On average, you hear something like this: "Oh, it was moving," Oh, it was powerful. Oh, he took us to the third heavens. Oh, he did this. Now they are attributing their experience to what the men of God did for them. And I have nothing, against that. But I want you to understand that they are not really saying anything at that point. They are simply enjoying this experience, this deeper experience, without actually asking, okay, so what has changed about me? What difference has it made? Without being rational about that experience and say, okay, what does this translate to? Please hear me. I'm not pulling down on anyone, and that's not my intention. My intention is to really go behind perhaps the culture, the worldview that's motivating that perspective that we may actually be oblivious to. That's the point I'm making here. And we really need to help people. Because most people, all they are after, if you've discovered a lot of churches, they just run deliverance ministries. So how do you build a kingdom that is just about delivering people every time? Deliverance, deliverance, deliverance. Now, shouldn't there be a time where we are really building people towards something, as opposed to just the experience is really just about this? Because there are parallels to that deliverance. These very aspects where witch doctors are instrumental, very instrumental. And I've already said a lot of African movies, that's what happens. People want to understand why is what is happening. So they consult. And they simply transpose from a witch doctor, perhaps, to a man of God, because they just want answers. They don't say, okay, what is God saying? Because they have direct access to that very God. Or what does His word teach? They simply want this person who they feel is at a much greater privileged position to help them with the way forward. So I've said a whole bunch of things here that may be shaking your world a little bit. My intention is that, yes, we have those things exposed so we can start asking rather serious questions that will help us. Let me make a few submissions, then we're going to turn into a key passage and walk through that and see how the Lord would help us today. The first submission I want to make up front is this, that the biblical conception of death perhaps has not been taught deep enough within the African context to supersede the traditional views with scriptural injunctions. Well, that's a loaded statement. It simply is saying this. Maybe we haven't really stopped long enough as God's people to say, what does the Bible actually teach about death? And do a well thought through, thorough analysis of what death is from a biblical point of view, so much that we, as God's people, inherit that perspective, internalize that perspective, it becomes our default position. So much that when a person dies in our culture, we are not going back to the cultural prescriptions. We understand, for example, that he has passed on to a better life. So he's actually in a much better place than we are. So the people who really need attention are us, and not the one who has passed on. And so you find in a culture that is an appreciation of that biblical injunctions, funerals are very simple, and funerals are done relatively quickly, and people try to move on and work towards how to negotiate life thereafter. But in moments where we feel there is an afterlife and this person has a say in this life, we're trapped. We're trapped yet again. because we have not yet spent enough time going through the scriptures. You know, the Bible is very, very explicit. If you look at 2 Samuel, you remember that story when David's son died, infant son dies. He makes this very bold statement. That's 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 23. He says, "But now he's dead. Why should I fast?" He was fasting that this son would live, and he died. He says, "Can I bring him back?" The answer is no. He says then, "I shall go to him." He recognizes one day, personally, I'll die, but he will not return to me. So there is a recognition by David that there's a one-way traffic here, that we will all die, but the dead don't come back. Finish. Do we have a full, well thought through appreciation of what this actually means? Perhaps that's not the only scripture we could use. Ecclesiastes chapter 9 verse 5 says this, "For the living know they will die." I like the little statistic I sometimes share with my friends. 1 out of 1 die. Everybody will. It's ultimate statistic. The dead know they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. In other words, the dead have no say amongst the living. This is the end game. When you die, it's over for you on earth. Do we actually understand that? Because it's very explicit in this text that we are looking at. Do we actually understand the dead have no say in this life? But let me make a second point here, that most scriptures that are cited during funerals are quite appropriately about comforting the bereaved. And yes, that's appropriate for the occasion, but all I'm saying is perhaps there is an oversight in saying, well, we really need an understanding of what is going on. More and more. And I've attended a number of funerals. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of the deceased, all of the dead, of the saints. Psalm 116 verse 15. You know, those are scriptures people like to read at this time. Or the death of Lazarus in Luke chapter 16 verses 19 through 31. John 5:24, Jesus making his declaration about those that are in him will find eternal rest and so forth. You know, Romans 8:38, you know, we are convinced that neither death nor life nor principalities shall separate us from the love that is in Christ. 1 Corinthians 15:12 through 31. I mean, that is a whole passage on the resurrection, but really talking about our transition from this life to the next and so forth. Now, all these are amazing scriptures. Philippians 1, to depart is to be present with the Lord. Love them. 1 Thessalonians 4:18, it says, I don't want you to misunderstand or not to understand about those who are asleep and so forth. Revelation 21 verse 4 talks about God will wipe away all our tears. Very comforting messages that we read to help the deceased. But, do we really stop and ask the question, do we understand what is going on? Do we have an appreciation of what is going on? Or do we hear these scriptures, but we still have this other perspective at play? So I want us to turn to a passage in 1 Samuel 28, 1 through 19, because I think it's a key reflective passage that would really assist us with an understanding of what to do when things go wrong.